So recently I made a video covering the strange phenomenon of villain worship in media. Basically the idea that audience members will ignore context clues in a story to support some weird belief that a character that's so obviously a villain and make the claim that they're actually a hero. Of course, with this being the internet, everybody left very well argued comments that totally didn't strawman my points. But there were actually some people who brought up excellent points. This comment in particular made me consider what makes for a good protagonist, so thanks for the great comment. I hope you're watching this video and that you enjoy it. So today I'll be discussing different ways to make a great protagonist. Now I need to lay some ground rules before I begin. Firstly, I won't cover any subjective elements of writing. Subjective advice can only take you so far given its nature as a personal emotional response rather than anything provable. Secondly, I will be taking into account morally gray characters or anti-heroes since, despite the title of this video, this won't entirely focus on any narrow points of heroism per se. More so, just well-crafted protagonists with generally morally ideal traits. You can of course make a protagonist that's also morally bankrupt and tell a great story, but this is just one way to make a character. Thirdly, this video will operate on the assumption that everyone watching will look at the examples listed on a purely objective and structural level. It does not matter if the characters listed are ones you personally resonate with. If I don't like a character, I can still concede if they're well crafted or not, and I expect the same of my audience. A good character isn't just a vibe, it's a structural and thematic masterpiece. Now, I've stated this before, but morality is technically subjective. What's right or wrong varies depending on the person, culture, or time period. But here's the kicker. In a story, the writers define the moral framework. The movie sets the rules for what's good, bad, or somewhere in between. If the protagonist follows the moral bounds of a story, then I'll consider them as a hero for this breakdown. Not to say that there aren't characters that exist in total moral grayness, but it's much harder to concretely give advice on how to make. My only advice for that kind of character is to make sure they fit the story you're crafting, and they aren't arbitrarily defined in regards to characterization. Take Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, for example. Raiden is a guy who's drowning in moral ambiguity. He's a child soldier turned cyborg mercenary. The world he lives in says violence is inevitable, and he buys into that. His arc works because the game's narrative clues, like the dialogue and nature of the gameplay, tell us that while killing isn't good, standing up to people who profit from suffering is. Raiden isn't perfect, but he aligns with the story's moral framework, with a somewhat ambiguous ending. I should make a video on this game someday. I'd say most protagonists need three main things: goals, obstacles, and agency. But before you can even get into that stuff, you need to ask yourself, what is your story? What does the character exist for? Now, of course, this isn't to say you can't have a story based around your character, but that's much easier to write since you could just create a fully fleshed out character and drop them into a wacky episodic series like a Plinko machine. Most writers want to have their character truly connected to their story, so that's what I'll be discussing. I was having dinner with a friend the other day, and we were discussing an idea he had for a film script, a horror film where his characters had to survive on an alien environment. He asked me for some feedback on the idea. He wanted a way to add more depth to the simple premise, and I suggested the idea that he have one character who caused a dangerous situation, and two other characters with vastly different perspectives on how to handle things. One who's more empathetic and open to helping the one who made the mistake, and another who is bitter with the guy who made the mistake for putting them in such a terrible situation. That way, you can force the characters into situations where their personalities clash, and either they have to work together or tear each other apart. A clash of egos over one mistake. Then consider the emotional toll this would have on the one guy who got them all into that mess. This is why I'd suggest having some idea of a story first before you even consider coming up with different characters to populate it. Come up with a general idea and an inciting incident, and your character should come naturally once you consider how the characters would work within the confines of the world you just created. And after that, you can draw from the refined differences and beliefs to create drama that forces the story forward. By creating characters this way, you don't run into situations where the protagonist is just dragged through the narrative with little to no reason, learning nothing, changing nothing, and doing nothing. You just get this cinematic disaster. And hey, if you can pull this off effectively enough, you can add the specific character traits you consider heroic if you so choose. This video isn't total clickbait, I swear. As the old adage goes, perfect heroes are boring, but honestly I think it's a bit of a reductive argument. Why can't a perfect hero who has an unwavering moral compass still be engaging? Well, like I said earlier, I won't get into subjective elements of storytelling here, since I see no value in a video dedicated to something that isn't actionable. But I'd like to bring up the idea that you can have a perfect character, but still put them in situations that test their moral compass or force them to confront elements about themselves that they bury deep down. Obviously, you shouldn't engineer your characters to be perfect vessels of perfectness without a reason, but it can be done. Here's the thing though, flaws or not, the internal and external struggles need to drive the story. James P. Sullivan in Monsters, Inc. is very clearly a great guy with no flaws through the entire film, but his views on his field of work shift dramatically, as with his views on human children. The only way this film stirs drama is by putting the perfect person in an imperfect situation, where heroic ideals only get him so far. Mike is the perfect narrative foil for Sully since he's a bit more selfish and impulsive, someone who, under the right circumstances, could be pushed to the brink against his best friend. That being said, heroes can be extremely flawed as well. My point isn't that one side is inherently more valuable than the other, it's circumstantial. What works for your story might not be the same solution that works for others. Take Tony Stark in Iron Man. He's egotistical, reckless, and downright selfish at the start, but those flaws are what drive the conflict. His weapons hurt people, he gets captured, his ego sometimes gets in the way of making the right decision. His arc is about turning those flaws into strengths, channeling his brilliance into heroism rather than self-indulgence. Flaws don't need to be fixed, though. Raiden's violent tendencies never go away completely, but at the end of Revengeance, he learns to wield them against the right enemies. That balance between embracing and controlling his darker side is what makes his character layered. Here's an underrated skill: context. If a story doesn't clearly establish its rules, what's good, bad, or acceptable, then it's easy for the hero's actions to be out of place. A well-crafted protagonist works because their actions fit the world they're in. Optimus Prime from Transformers is a classic example. He's a warrior who preaches for peace, but also kills his enemies without hesitation. How does that work? They establish the Autobots and Decepticons are in a literal war for survival. In that context, Optimus's actions are consistent. He's not killing for fun, but to protect life. Compare this to poorly written hero who's inconsistent, flip-flopping between ideals without reason. If Marlin suddenly abandoned Nemo halfway through their movie with no logical reason, the legitimacy of everything established about the character would be called into question. Consistency is key. Will Turner is another great example. He's a good guy, but he lies, steals, and even betrays Jack Sparrow at times. These choices don't make him a bad protagonist, they're part of his arc. His willingness to make tough decisions, even morally questionable ones, shows his growth from a friendly young man from Port Royal into a fearsome pirate in his own right. It's logically driven based on both his moral limits and the clash between his morality and the world he inhabits that motivates his arc. And let's get this straight. Likability and relatability are not what make a hero well written. They're just the color of the frosting on a cake. A character can be completely unrelatable and still great if they're crafted with clear goals, consistent actions, and a meaningful arc. You can't make a character likable. Your audience will find elements that you've planted that might help them gravitate towards a character, but it's not like a math equation where you can almost certainly get the right outcome if you pull it off perfectly. Given how Jake Sully in Avatar is a nearly flawlessly executed character in every sense of the word, with logically driven motivations, consistent elements of characterization, a direct stake in the outcome of the film where his choices carry a shit ton of weight, yet people still insist that they don't like him for whatever bullshit subjective argument that they could fart out of their ass. And I should add that no story or character needs to be complex. Simple characters and simple stories can be well executed to the same effectiveness as complex ones. To attribute quality to complexity is a fallacy, yes, but it also encourages writers to overstuff their stories because they don't want people to write off the work at the outset. If you're someone who thinks quality and complexity are linked, I encourage you to reconsider your stance. A well-crafted hero doesn't just exist in a vacuum. They need to matter. Their story should have stakes. Their growth should be earned. Marlin's transformation from an overprotective father to someone who trusts his son works because the movie builds to it. Indiana Jones's arc works because he managed to learn to respect the cultures and people around him over the course of the film. Marion was originally just a means to an end, but became the sole reason he stayed on his quest later on. Crafting a great hero is like baking a cake. The base, the goals, characters, dynamics, agency, and consistency is what makes them stand tall. The moral framework and context clues are the frosting that ties us all together. And the subjective stuff? That's just sprinkles. The hero doesn't have to be your best friend or someone you agree with, but they have to work within your story. If you nail all the fundamentals, you have yourself a protagonist worth rooting for. That's it for today's video. If you liked it, give it a like and hit the subscribe button, join my Patreon page for early access to my videos, and join my Discord server. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.